Greetings and welcome. Let's check out the 2018 number 1 about grocery stores free response question on the AP Statistics exam. I will assume you've already read the question, but to summarize, random sample of 11 customers. We have a scatter plot here that shows the number of customers in line and how long it takes to check out given the number of customers in line. We have some regression output, which is very exciting. And the first question is identify and interpret in context the estimate of the Y-intercept for the least squares regression line. So from the computer output, the first row, all this stuff, is related to the Y-intercept. And the first column, the coefficient column, tells you the estimate of the Y-intercept. So it looks like we got 72.95. And then we interpret that. So we would say when there are 0 customers in line, we expect to wait about 72.95. The units are what? Seconds? Surely I hope it's not minutes. So what are really important features of your answer? First, you need to have you have to identify the Y-intercept, so 72.95. That's one of the 3 things you have to do. Next, it has to be something about that it's this expectation, or it's a prediction we predict, or maybe the predicted seconds that we have to wait. So that's the second thing that you have to identify. And then the third thing is the context. You have to mention the 0 customers in line and the waiting time, or the seconds. So 3 things to be able to score an E. Again, you have to have the context. That says context. You need context both the customers and the waiting in seconds. You need the 72.95. And lastly, you need some kind of recognition that it's a prediction or an estimate of the waiting time. If you did 3 of the 3, you get an E. If you did 2 of the 3, you get a partial. Let's look at part B. Identify and interpret in context the coefficient of determination r squared. So r squared is this value, 73.33, 73.33%. We're not out of partial just yet. We need one more thing. There are 3 components that we need. Just as a warning, don't use r squared adjusted. That's not part of the AP curriculum, so we'll ignore that. Don't write that one. So what does r squared tell us? R squared tells us the percentage of variability. So 73.33% of variability, or variation, in the response. The response variable is wait time. Wait time. In seconds is accounted for by the least squares regression line using the number of customers as our explanatory variable. So that would be the interpretation, or one of many possible correct interpretations. But to get an E, you would need 3 things. You would need to get the r squared correct. You need to have context, so the waiting time and the customers. and then it has to be something about the variability in the response with the regression line. So get those three things, and you have another E. Now let's look at part C. One of the points was determined to be an outlier. Circle the point on the scatter plot and explain why the point is considered an outlier. Well, I hope you chose this point. That in and of itself would get you a partial. And even if you didn't circle the point, but if you identified it as 3, 80 maybe, it's kind of hard to tell, but 3, 80 maybe, that could also get you a partial if you didn't explicitly circle the point. So how do we describe this as an outlier? Well, it's not enough just to say that it has a large residual, for instance. You'd have to make some explicit comparison to the other points. So compared to the other points, this has the largest residual, this vertical distance, so therefore it's an outlier. Another issue is you don't want to just say that like its y-coordinate is different or its x-coordinate is different, because really the y-coordinate isn't that different from this y-coordinate. And then likewise, its x-coordinate is not that different from like these x-coordinates. It's not that far away from the x-coordinates. But the combination of the x and the y-coordinate make this point unique from all the other points. I wanted to show you some examples of what to say and what not to say when describing an outlier like this. A lot of times on the AP exam, communication is really important, and the way you say things could be interpreted in the wrong way. So let's go over to the scoring guidelines online. Check that out. So part C is scored as an E if you correctly identify the outlier. We did that. Describes an unusual feature of the identified scatter plot point relative to the remaining points is really important. That's sufficient to identify. So bullet point 1, the combination of x and y is unusual compared to the other points. The value of y is much lower than to be expected given the other points, so that's the residual they're talking about. Or the residual is unusually large compared to the other points. So notice each of these is compared to the other points, compared to the remaining points, relative to the other residuals. So it's really important for students to compare the point that they're arguing is an outlier to all the other points. And you can see here that if a response only has component 1, they circled it right, but they don't satisfy component 2. They weren't able to explain it correctly. So I wanted to show you some of the notes down here. So note number 1. In the absence of any point being circled on the graph, component 1 can still be satisfied. Oh, I already mentioned that. Note number 2. A response that does not make a comparison to the remaining points, such as stating the outlier has a large residual, or is nowhere near the regression line, does not satisfy component 2. So it's tempting to say, well, it's an outlier because it's nowhere close to the line, but you have to compare it to the points, not the line. Or an outlier has a large residual, it has to be in comparison to the points. Note number 3, a response that makes a comparison to the remaining points based upon a usual feature that is insufficient for outlier identification, such as stating the point is the only point with that particular y value, does not satisfy component 2. And then note 4, in the absence of explicit numerical calculation, a response that appeals to the influence that the outlier has on the regression coefficient estimates does not satisfy component 2. Now with those things in mind, let's jump over to this response and see what you think. This student said that point is an outlier because it does not follow the pattern of the rest of the data points follow and is very far from the rest of the data. So if you need to pause this video and think about that, how would you score that? Would you score that an E, a P, or an I? So this response did circle the correct point. And the response also mentioned, in comparison to the other points, it does not follow the pattern of the rest of the data points, and it is very far from the rest of the data. So this would be scored an E. Let's check out another one. This student circled the outlier. This student says, this point is considered an outlier because its value is very far from the predicted value of the least squares regression line. The point's value is about 100, while when there are 3 customers in line, the least squares regression line predicts a value of about 600. So how do you think that would be scored? They're already at a partial because they did circle. Oops, they did circle the point. Do they get an E? Well, they've said because its value is very far from the predicted value. That doesn't make it an outlier. Imagine a line. Imagine if we had a data set like this. And here's our line, roughly. Oh, I missed. Try to split those in half. Here's our line. Couldn't you say that like all of these are very far away from their predicted? So that's not sufficient. This would be scored a partial. They did circle the point correctly, but they did not explain well enough that the outlier is far away from the data, far away from the trend of the rest of the data. So they earned a partial. Now let's look at one more, and let's look at some of the, let's look at the whole response. We have a circled point, okay. We have part A, the estimate given for the intercept is 72.95. This means that with 0 customers in line, one would expect the time to finish checkout to be approximately 72.95. How do you think that would be scored? So they've identified the Y-intercept, so that's one of the 3. They have that we expect, and not as strong, but approximately was also recognition, at least accepted on this rubric as recognition of an expectation or a prediction. And then lastly, they have context, customers in line, and time to check out. So that would be scored an E. Let's read part B now. How do you think that would be scored? First, they did not correctly identify R squared. Looks like they might have used R squared adjusted. Also, the variance of results from the expected times is not the correct interpretation of R squared. And they did get a little bit of context, but they only got 1 out of 3. So this would be scored an incomplete. And lastly, part C. Let's check that out. They did circle the point, so they're at a partial so far. And go ahead and read that, and how do you think that'll be scored? This one was got a little close there. So they had significantly further from the regression line or expected time for each number of customers. Thankfully, they didn't stop there. If they had stopped there, that would not be sufficient. But since they said then any other point, they're now effectively comparing the point to the other points, and that this point is very different than the other points. So this would be scored an E. So part A was an E, part B, A was an E, B was an I, and part C was an E. So this scored A2 on the AP exam. Hope this video was helpful. Watch my next video where we discuss another FRQ.